Uh, what I would like to give you is a view coming from food markets. We have had, since the beginning of this decade, a period of many tensions on world food markets. It began, in fact, even before COVID, even before Ukraine. It began with the development, the huge rise of Chinese imports of grains. By 2021, China was importing 50 million tons of grain, wheat, corn, sorghum, and I remember that 50 million tons because that was exactly the tonnage of grain that formerly USSR was importing in 1980 when there was an embargo against USSR because USSR invaded Afghanistan. That's an old story. You remember there was something called USSR formerly. But they were importing 50 million tons. They were the world's biggest grain importer. Now, Black Sea, that is the former USSR, is the world's biggest exporter of wheat mainly, but of grain as a whole. USSR doesn't exist anymore. China is the world's biggest grain importer right now. So you see, history is changing. Then we had Ukraine, and with the idea that the Black Sea could be blocked, prices almost doubled. We reached $500 per ton for wheat. And then we had, and remember, that on other products, for example, for my neighbor in Indonesia, they suffered with the embargo decided by the Indian authority on rice exports. What happened since then, and what's the situation right now? I would say normalization. We had rather good crops on a worldwide basis. You might have heard about El Nino or La Nina, but in recent months, we haven't had anything. Unfortunately, the only place where crops were not very good this year, it was France. But apart from that, we have very good crops on a worldwide basis, be it in the US, be it in Brazil, be it now in the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, Argentina, and so on. China is less on the market, and that's an important thing. And finally, India has had a very good monsoon. So prices now on worldwide food markets are more or less what they were before COVID and Ukraine. I told you that wheat price reached $500 per ton on around May 2022, and right now we are just at half that price. Russia is trying to have a kind of a minimum price, $250 per ton FOB Russian Black Sea port, but it doesn't work very well. And we have seen a very steep decline of prices for corn, soybeans, etc. If you want to see some excitation on markets, well, you're just coming out from your breakfast. It's clear that coffee, cocoa, orange juice, if you're from the Mediterranean, some olive oil in your breakfast. All those products have seen prices going up, generally for climatic reasons. But I would say that's a normal market history. You have had also some tensions. Two of my neighbors are directly concerned for sugar. Because in fact we have had 3 years of deficit on the worldwide sugar market and on palm oil. And on those two, there is an interesting link. That is, why is sugar prices pretty high? You don't know that, but India is the world's second normal sugar exporter, behind Brazil. This year, India won't export any sugar, because that sugar will be converted in ethanol. And there is a link, of course, between food and energy. Same story with Indonesia. In Indonesia, the government decided that you should put more palm oil in your diesel. And Indonesia is the world's biggest palm oil exporter. There is less palm oil in the market. Prices are going up. So you see the impact. What conclusion can we have on those 4 or 5 years? The first, in rich countries, we have had some impact on food inflation. You should ask Kamala Harris what she thinks about food inflation in the States. Also, it must be stressed that the share of agricultural products in the final food products is very slim. So when we say, especially in developed countries, but also in emerging countries, when you look at agricultural prices, it's fairly different from food prices. In our beloved French baguette, the share of wheat in bread is around 8%, not more. Far less than the cost of energy and the cost of the baker intervention. In poor countries, it's clear that you have had an impact on food poverty. And the countries which are managed finally to limit that are those that have, besides an agricultural policy, a food policy. You know that, for example, in India, 46% of agricultural subsidies go to consumption. Even more, in the States, in the United States, 55% of the US agricultural budget goes to food stamps, when in Africa, it's none. That's, I would say, the big difference, the problem between agricultural policy and food policy. Also, one interesting thing, as far as geopolitics are concerned, is that we have had a certain kind of return to the use of food as a weapon. I told you about the embargo, the American embargo of 1980. This year, Russia donated some wheat to some African countries, well, very well chosen, the one who are more or less supporting Russia in its aggression to Ukraine. But that's interesting. The use of food as a weapon, which has almost disappeared and which is coming back. We should look, by the way, next year, probably as to the rise of tariff on food by the Chinese authorities against US products. There has been a frenzy of soybean buying by Chinese companies to the US before the end of the year, before January the 20th and the arrival of Donald Trump. So globally, and I will conclude on that, to my mind, production, agricultural production, is not really a problem. There is sufficient food produced, sufficient agricultural products produced in the world to satisfy human needs. And I would be rather hopeful. When we were younger, Jean-Michel, there was a book written by Joseph Klassmann in France, Nourrir 10 milliards d'hommes, how to feed 10 billion people. I think the world will be able to feed 10 billion people. The problem is not there. The problem is a problem of poverty. Trade, I'm afraid to say, is not really the solution. Self-sufficiency, to my mind, should be a problem. Food poverty, when I listen to our friend in Rome, the problem, well, it can be on some markets, you can have a problem one year because of climate and so on. But on the whole, the big question to my mind is a question of food poverty. And that one, it can be averted probably both through agricultural and food policies. The problem is, I'm sometimes dreaming not of the very complex system of insurance, etc., which the FAO loves, but since pretty simple, like we had in Europe with the common agricultural policy. The common agricultural policy was a success. It allowed Europe to become not only self-sufficient but an exporter. I'm sometimes dreaming of the equivalent of a common agricultural policy in many African countries, for example, but at the end of the day, I have no answer to who pays for it.
Thank you very much, Philippe, to continue setting the landscape, normalization, permanence of structural issues, trade wars, geopolitics through subsidies, customs rights, etc. We're on the full game, and this optimistic note about the capacity of the world to produce for itself. And I know, Professor Krishnamurti, dear Bayu, that you're going to follow up on some of those issues.